The metallic tang of irradiated dust and stale synthale coated the grime on my worn combat fatigues. It was a familiar burden, a sharp reminder that another punishing shift at the Rust Bucket Cantina in New Vegas sector was finally winding down. My synthetic boots, patched with salvaged rubber, ached with a deep, persistent burn that had set in since the sun hit the high mesa. But the handful of power cells Astra had slipped me after servicing the last sandcrawler made the pain a distant drone. Astra, my only kin in the dust zone, was currently sealing the access hatch on the back door. Her usual wry grin was strained tonight, drawn tight over the anxiety etched into her face. Her debt to Ronan Thorne, the sovereign of the Arcology, was a radiation shadow stretching across both our meager lives. Every extra circuit I wired, every salvage run I pushed, it was all for her. My own phantom memory of a simple life, where the air was clean and choices weren't measured in life support minutes, felt like a faded broadcast. But Astra was my last thread of family, and that line held firm. "You synced," I muttered, running a deactivated energy cloth over the pitted steel counter, the cheap ethanol cleaner biting at my nostrils. The rust bucket was nearly empty, leaving behind scattered shell casings and a few abandoned data chips. Astra sighed, aggressively scrubbing a cracked synth glass. "Just tired, Lyra. Tired of crawling on the grit." He sent a priority burst this morning. She didn't have to name him. Ronan Thorne's designation, the Sovereign, hung in the thick air, heavy and lethal. The burst demanded she present herself at the Arcology Prime's main uplink tonight. A cold spike of dread shot through me. Despite the suffocating heat of the cantina, Ronan Thorne didn't request meetings. He issued edicts, usually delivered by hulking enforcers in mirrored chrome armor. And he certainly didn't meet low-caste scavengers in person without a specific, and usually ruinous, agenda. My stomach twisted into a leaden knot. This was compromised. Just as I was about to demand details, the front airlock cycled, announcing a late arrival. I snapped my head up, my internal chronometer skipping a beat. 3 figures stood in the doorway, and even across the space, they radiated raw, optimized danger. 2 were chassis-built, augmented soldiers, clad in razor-sharp obsidian polymer that probably cost more than a year of water rations. The third, however, was the nexus of all attention. He wasn't merely imposing. He was a machine of lethal grace. Tall, with a coiled kinetic energy in his stance, and a face that seemed sculpted from rare, unforgiving ferrosteel. Hard angles and clean, deadly planes. His black hair was slicked back, dark as a neutron star, and his custom-fitted battlesuit seemed to hum with silent, destructive power. It was Ronan Thorne, unmistakable. His ocular sensor swept the near-empty cantina, his gaze cold and dismissive, until it locked onto Astra. A micro-expression, almost too fast to track, crossed his face. Not recognition, but a functional assessment. He began walking toward her, his movements fluid and precise, like a hunter tracking a thermal signature. The 2 augmented guards fanned out, creating an impenetrable force field between him and the outside world. Astra's hand, polishing the glass, slipped. The synth glass clattered onto the shock mat behind the bar with a muffled impact. All color drained from her face, leaving her dust-filmed skin stark. She looked like she'd seen a data ghost, or worse, a system purge. A white-hot surge of pure, primal protectiveness galvanized me. My fists clenched around the cleaning rag. Ronan halted directly in front of Astra, his presence a pressure cooker suffocating the recycled air around her. He held the silence for a charged moment, simply looking at her, and the sheer, calculated contempt in his augmented eyes was a physical blow. It was the look that reduced you to zero utility, utterly disposable, and it ignited the dormant fire in my core. My fear for Astra momentarily vaporized my self-preservation instinct. Astra! His voice was a low, synthesized rumble, surprisingly smooth, yet overlaid with a sonic signature of unyielding power. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet cantina like a sonic blade. I believe we have an outstanding protocol to execute. Astra swallowed, her gaze flickering, searching for a non-existent exit vector. She wrung her hands. I'm attempting to reprioritize. I only require a small data cycle more. Her voice was a thin, high-frequency whine, barely audible. She sounded small, helpless, and that was the fault line that finally fractured my control. I remembered Astra's parents years ago, working themselves into biological failure, exploited by a corporate lord who jacked the fuel costs. I remembered the powerlessness, the way I had fought for them, only to be dismissed as insignificant static. I remembered the helplessness of watching the system crush the innocent, too small, too young to intervene. I wasn't that same powerless child. Ronan Thorne's mouth twitched, a soundless motion devoid of mirth, dry and mechanical. He reached into a hidden compartment in his suit and extracted a small black ceramic box. He didn't open it immediately, letting it dangle from a silver wire just out of Astra's reach. The air crackled with a localized energy field, and the scent of ozone and high-grade lubricant, sharp and alien, flooded my olfactory sensors. My knuckles were pale white. Time, Miss Astra, is a resource you no longer possess, he stated, his eyes the color of a stormy winter data sky, completely devoid of warmth. Then, with a sudden sharp gesture, he activated the box and let its contents spill onto the counter's polished surface. They weren't credits or paper script. They were small, glittering crystalline shards, perfectly cut data cores that caught the cantina's dim light and splintered it into 1,000 tiny sparks. They lay there, a gaudy display, mocking Astra's struggle for survival. This, he continued, gesturing to the cores with a long, elegant finger, is the calculated value of your debt in full. He paused, letting the statement hang, allowing us to process the sheer, casual overflow of wealth he was flaunting. Silas, the beefy owner, had emerged from the back, his face slack with fear, but he wisely held his position. Then Ronan's lips curved into a slow, chilling arc that didn't engage his eyes. Consider it a severance package, Astra. You are offline here. Debt status cleared. You are unbound. Astra's head snapped up, her eyes wide with system shock, then dawning relief. Truly? But by what metric? My generosity has its own protocols and its own demands, he said, his gaze flickering toward me for the barest microsecond before returning to Astra. You will not operate in this sector again. Not in any establishment associated with my network. You will initiate immediate transit tonight, and you will not attempt contact with your former life. His words struck me with the concussive force of a stun blast. He wasn't liberating her. He was exiling her, purging her from her livelihood, her contacts, her entire existence simply because she incurred a debt. He was humiliating her, dismantling her essence, reducing her to nothing. And then, as if to underscore the finality of his authority, he swept his hand across the counter, sending the glittering data cores skittering across the floor, scattering them like worthless gravel. A deep seismic fury erupted within me. It wasn't a tactical thought, not a conscious decision. It was raw impulse, a burning need to strike back, to defend Astra against this callous display of optimized power, this cruel systemic injustice. This man, with his cold sensors and his expensive battlesuit, believed he could shatter a life and suffer no consequences. My hand lashed out before my conscious mind even registered the action. The sound was sharp, resonant, a crack that echoed in the sudden, stunned silence of the cantina. My palm stung, a burning sensation that vibrated up my arm. Ronan Thorne's head snapped to the side, his cheekbone showing a faint red scorch mark almost instantly under the force of the blow. His expensive lubricant mingled with the faint metallic scent of burnt ozone in the air. For a split second, a profound, almost temporal silence fell. Even the two augmented guards froze, their optics widening in disbelief, their hands hovering near their weapons. My breath hitched, caught somewhere in my throat, a tiny ragged sound. The world seemed to narrow, all the noise and light receding until only Ronan and I existed in a charged bubble. His face, which had been so cold, so functionally impassive moments before, now held an expression I could not decode. Shock, yes, but something deeper, more intense and unnerving. He rotated his head slowly, his gaze, those storm cloud sensors sweeping over my face. It wasn't fury that etched his features. Not immediately. It was something far more chilling. An intense, almost analytical curiosity. His eyes locked with mine, holding me immobilized, and I felt a seismic tremor run down my spine, a cold singularity forming in my gut. The sting in my palm was nothing compared to the sudden, overwhelming realization of my action. I had struck Ronan Thorne. A faint, almost imperceptible smile, utterly devoid of human warmth, slowly spread across his lips. It was a predator's facial tic, chilling me to the bone. He raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and touched his marked cheek, his fingertips brushing the red scorch mark I had left. The movement was so calm, so mathematically measured, that it felt infinitely more menacing than any roar of rage. The fear, bone-deep and cryogenic, finally hit me. My initial outrage had spent itself, leaving behind a terrible clarity. I had just initiated hostilities with the most dangerous entity in the entire Mojave sector. Astra's future, my own future, perhaps even our physical integrity, had just been irrevocably altered by my impulsive act. A wave of nausea washed over me, and my synthetic knees felt fluid, ready to buckle. But then beneath the terror, a strange, exhilarating current began to flow. A wild, defiant surge. I had done it. I had breached his firewall. I had forced a reaction, even if it was just the physical sting of my hand. I met his gaze, my chin lifting instinctively, a stubborn, unyielding spark igniting deep inside my core. "Finally," he stated, his voice a low, grumbling whisper that seemed to vibrate through the floor plates. His eyes, still locked on mine, held an unnerving intensity, as if he were seeing my true data signature for the first time. Someone real. His words, cryptic and chilling, made no logical sense, yet they resonated with a disturbing weight. Someone real. What did that even mean in this hypersynthetic world? I wanted to scream, to run, to rewind the last 5 minutes and pretend the protocol had never been initiated. But I couldn't. I just stood there, my chest heaving, listening to the frantic double-time beat of my own biological pulse in my ears. The air was thick with implied threats, with the dangerous, unforeseen connection that had just been forged between us. The guards, finally shaking off their stupor, moved not toward me for retaliation, but to flank Ronan, their expressions grim. One of them spoke into a discreet throat mic, his voice a low murmur. Ronan, however, didn't divert his gaze from me, not even for a second. His eyes were like a physical force pressing down, demanding compliance. "Scrub this area," he commanded, still looking at me, his voice carrying just enough to reach Silas, who was now virtually cowering behind the bar. "Everything. And transmit a final purge order to Astra by solar dawn." He turned his head then, the movement slow and deliberate, and finally disengaged from my gaze. He didn't speak another word. He simply turned, his bodyguards moving in sync, and walked out of the Rust Bucket cantina. The airlock's chime was a soft, mocking farewell. The cantina, which had been silent, suddenly erupted into a cacophony of hushed whispers and urgent motions. Silas was shouting, Astra was weeping, and the few remaining patrons were scrambling for the door, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. "Lyra, what have you done?" Astra wailed, rushing over to me, her hands gripping my arms. Her tears were warm against my skin. That was Ronan Thorne. "He's going to." She couldn't complete the sentence, dissolving into fresh sobs. Silas, though, was less empathetic. "DAZN. Lyra. Both of you. This sector is contaminated. I can't believe your idiocy." His face was mottled red, a volatile mix of fear and fury. He was correct. There was no way I could stay. No way Astra could remain operational here. My mind was a chaotic blur of fragmented thoughts. Someone real. The way he'd looked at me, not with rage, but with something unsettlingly like interest. The strange, unwelcome pull I'd felt. A flicker of awareness that he saw something in me, something beyond a simple bartender/scavenger. It was terrifying and, yes, exhilarating in a twisted, survivalist way. That defiance, that instinct to shield my kin, had placed me squarely in his targeting matrix. "Astra," I stated, my voice surprisingly stable despite the tremors in my hands. I gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "We need to initiate transit now." We stumbled out of the Rust Bucket into the cool night air, leaving behind the chaos and the lingering scent of burnt synthale. The flickering security lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like something pre-programmed. Astra clung to me, sobbing quietly while I walked on autopilot. My heightened senses registered every shadow as a potential threat. We returned to our tiny salvaged bunker. The place felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable. Astra immediately began packing a small tactical bag, her movements frantic. "I have to leave, Lyra," he said. "Tonight." I have to go. Her voice was laced with a desperate frequency I'd never heard from her before. I watched her, a hollow, cold ache expanding in my chest. This was my systemic failure. My reckless impulse had driven her out, away from her life, her sector. But what choice did I have? I couldn't allow him to break her like that. Not after everything. Where will you reroute? I asked, though I already knew her emergency protocol. She had a distant relative in the Utah Territory, a reclusive tech shaman she rarely communicated with. It's irrelevant, she sniffled, pulling a faded environmental hood from her locker. Anywhere but here. Anywhere outside his network. She paused, then looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate plea. Please, Lyra, you have to initiate caution. He's not like other humans. I hugged her tight, the rough synth fabric of her hood scratching my cheek. I know. I'll maintain safety protocols. Just initiate contact when you reach the safe zone. The words felt hollow, a temporary fix to soothe her and myself. Safe was the antithesis of my current status. After Astra initiated transit, the bunker felt impossibly vast, echoing with a silence that pressed down on me. I tried to clean, to find a distraction, scrubbing the already spotless synth fiber countertops, running my hand over the rough weave of the emergency blanket, but my mind kept replaying the confrontation. The crack of my palm, the way Ronan Thorne's head had snapped back, the unnerving intensity in his eyes. Someone real. I took a sonic shower, trying to wash away the lingering tension, the metallic scent of fear and anger. The hot air stung my still tender palm. When I emerged, wrapped in my oldest, softest field poncho, the world outside my bunker window seemed calmer, almost normalized. A sandcrawler passed, its lights briefly illuminating the dusty perimeter. But inside me a plasma storm was brewing. My communit, which I'd left charging on my nightstand, vibrated. A text message. My heart gave a painful spike. It wasn't Astra. The sender ID was unfamiliar, encrypted. I unlocked my screen, my fingers trembling slightly. The message was short, direct, and written in a formal, almost archaic syntax. Ms. Vance, your presence is requested at the Arcology Prime's Tower Apex. Coordinates 1421 Belladonna Way. Tomorrow at 1900 hours sharp. We have Astra Bianca's debt parameters to discuss. Your prompt arrival will ensure Miss Astra's continued operational freedom. Failure to attend will unfortunately result in dire consequences for your associate. Do not fail the attendance check. LR. My breath hitched, a cold singularity forming in my throat. He wasn't finished. He was initiating the next phase of the protocol. He hadn't retaliated directly, not physically. He had found a more insidious vector to ensnare me, using the one anchor he knew I valued most, Astra. He knew my weakness and he was exploiting it, drawing me into his network, demanding my compliance. There was no escape. Not if I wanted Astra to be truly unbound. I stared at the message, the words burning into my retinas, the chilling certainty settling in my bones. I had to go. I had zero choice. The old digital clock on my nightstand glowed 1817. The red number stark against the fading exterior light. My hands felt clammy, a nervous biosweat pricking my palms as I stared at my reflection in a cracked panel. What did one wear to meet a self-proclaimed arcology baron who held your only kin's future hostage? Definitely not my stained rust bucket uniform. I'd settled on a simple dark blue synth dress. Nothing ornate, just a clean functional cut that felt like a flimsy shield. It was the best I owned, a salvaged garment I usually saved for job interviews that never materialized. The rough fabric of the dress felt oddly grounding against my skin, a small anchor in the internal chaos. The air in the bunker was still, heavy with the quiet absence of Astra. It smelled faintly of her lavender-scented lubricant and the stale processed protein bars we'd shared last night. My mind kept replaying the message from LR, the formal, chilling words echoing in my head. Your prompt arrival will ensure Miss Astra's continued operational freedom. He knew exactly how to find the weakness, exactly where my ethical core lay. This wasn't about Astra's failed debt cycle anymore. This was about me. I pulled my hair back into a tight braid, attempting to project an air of composure I definitely didn't possess. My reflection stared back, eyes wide and a little too hyper-aware. They held a stubborn defiance, though a flicker of the fire that had made me strike him in the first place. That spark, though terrifying, was also the only thing preventing systemic shutdown. I wasn't going to submit. Not yet. I'd attempt to negotiate a new protocol. I'd find a way to shield Astra without losing my own core programming. Or at least I hoped I would. The thought was a thin, trembling energy wire stretched taut across a chasm of existential fear. A sleek, black, fully shielded transport glided up precisely at 1845. It was an armored vehicle, tinted sensor windows reflecting the flickering emergency lights like dark mirrors. My throat felt restricted, a cold node forming as I walked out of the bunker's shielded entrance. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain that had been diverted. The driver, a hulking enforcer in a dark suit with a blank, unreadable faceplate, simply cycled the back door open for me. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at me directly, just a silent, imposing presence. Sliding into the plush leather seat felt like stepping into a different dimension. The interior smelled faintly of high-grade cologne and something else, something metallic and clean like polished synth steel. My fingers pressed against the smooth, cool leather of the seat, a stark contrast to the worn fabric of my own emergency sofa. The car moved off seamlessly. No sudden acceleration jolts, no engine roar, just a smooth glide through the perimeter streets. I watched the familiar rubblescape of the New Vegas sector melt away, replaced by increasingly grander, fortified homes, then by winding Trilene-replaced hover roads that led to territories I'd only ever seen on corrupted data files. This wasn't merely a rich compound. It was an independent, fortified state. The Arcology Prime loomed into view. A monolithic structure of dark, fractal-cut stone and gleaming sensor glass, set against a backdrop of ancient, towering communication spires. It wasn't a building. It was a fortress radiating power and an almost menacing optimized opulence. High walls topped with intricate plasma grid defenses stretched endlessly. Security cameras, subtle but omnipresent, seemed to track our every motion. The air outside felt colder, thinner despite the faint warmth of the transport's engine. A tremor ran down my spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was the final checkpoint. No return route now. We passed through an imposing gate that slid open without a sound, then continued up a long winding access road flanked by perfectly manicured synth lawns. The silence inside the car was deafening, amplifying the frantic rhythm of my own heart. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my pulse, trying to conjure that stubborn spark of defiance again. This wasn't just for Astra. It was for me, to prove I wasn't some disposable component to be recycled. The SUV stopped in front of the massive ferrosteel doors of the Arcology. They were grand, imposing, a testament to old-world money and unyielding control. The driver cycled my door open, his expression still neutral, and I stepped out onto a crushed gravel path that crunched softly under my worn heels. The night air was unnaturally fresh here, carrying the faint processed scent of damp soil and distant engineered pines, a small grounding detail in an otherwise overwhelming environment. My dress, though clean, felt suddenly inadequate, cheap, a low-grade artifact. As I stood there, feeling dwarfed by the sheer scale of the structure, the immense doors slid inward, revealing a cavernous entry hall. It was a space engineered to impress, to intimidate. Gleaming marble floors stretched out, reflecting the light from an enormous crystal energy chandelier that hung from a vaulted ceiling. The air inside was cool, dry, and carried the subtle, expensive scent of old wood polish and something herbal like dried data rosemary. 2 more men in heavy combat suits stood guard inside, equally imposing, equally silent. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "This way, Miss Vance." A new voice, surprisingly gentle yet firm, broke the silence. A woman impeccably dressed in a tailored black synth suit stepped forward from the shadows. She had a severe, no-nonsense bob and eyes that processed every detail. She didn't smile. No one here smiled. I nodded, my voice stuck somewhere in my throat. My heels clicked softly against the marble as I followed her, the sound echoing ominously in the vast space. Every step felt like a march towards a predetermined outcome. She led me through a maze of corridors, each one more ornate than the last, lined with heavy digitized tapestries and dark antique furniture that looked like museum artifacts. It was beautiful undeniably, but cold, impersonal, optimized for loneliness. My fingers brushed against the rough texture of a silk wall covering as we passed. A small, desperate attempt to connect with something tactile. Finally, she stopped before a large, carved synthwood door. She didn't knock. She simply opened it, stepped aside, and gestured me in. "The Sovereign will see you now." I walked into a study, or perhaps a data library. The room was immense, lined from floor to ceiling with shelves packed with leather-bound databooks. The rich, earthy scent of old paper and wood filled the air, a familiar comfort that momentarily eased the tension in my chest. A large, ornate desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it, silhouetted against a tall window overlooking a moonlit, segmented garden, sat Ronan Thorne. He didn't look up immediately. He was digitally signing a document, his head bent, the desk lamplight casting deep shadows on his sharp features. He looked different tonight, less overtly predatory than he had in the cantina, more self-contained. His suit was still impeccable, tailored perfectly, but he exuded a quiet, almost scholarly intensity hunched over his work. He could have been any powerful executive, if you ignored the palpable aura of controlled danger that clung to him like a second skin. My eyes lingered on the faint red mark still visible on his cheekbone, a ghostly low-resolution reminder of my impulsive strike. A tiny spark of satisfaction, quickly extinguished by a fresh wave of fear, flickered within me. After what felt like an eternity, he capped his smart pen with a precise click and finally raised his head. His eyes, the color of wet slate under the lamplight, met mine. There was no anger there, no outward hostility, just that unnerving analytical curiosity I remembered from the cantina. He didn't smile, but a hint of something flickered in their depths, something that made the fine hairs on my arm stand on end. He gestured to one of the two plush antique armchairs opposite his desk. "Miss Vance, please sit." His voice was low, smooth, devoid of any discernible emotion. I walked over, my movements stiff, and sank into the armchair. The velvet upholstery was soft, luxurious, but offered no true comfort. The desk between us felt like a chasm, a tangible representation of the power differential. I laced my fingers together, pressing my thumbs into my knuckles, trying to project calm. The air crackled, thick with unsent data. Tea, synth coffee, or perhaps something with a higher ethanol content, he offered, his gaze still holding mine. It wasn't a hospitable offer, more like a diagnostic test. He probably expected me to refuse, to maintain a defiant distance. "No, thank you," I stated, my voice steadier than I expected. My throat felt scratchy and I longed for a glass of processed water, but asking for it felt like weakness. He nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Direct. I appreciate that." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Let's be direct, then. Astra is free. Her debt is fully paid. She is no longer bound by any obligation to me or my operational network. You ensured that." A wave of relief so potent it almost made my knees buckle washed over me. Astra was truly unbound. My impulsive act, my fear, it had all been worth the risk. "However," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, the other shoe dropping with calculated precision, "that freedom came at a cost. Not to Astra, but to you." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, allowing me to fully grasp the implication. The scent of aged leather from the databooks was almost intoxicating, but it couldn't mask the growing dread. "You struck me, Miss Vance," he said, touching his cheek again, a slow, deliberate gesture. An act of unprecedented defiance. Most would expect retribution. Vengeance. My breath hitched. My heart gave a frantic flutter against my ribs. Here it was. "But I am not like most," he continued, a flicker of something unsettling in his eyes. "You showed me a data set I haven't seen in a very long time. Something real. A raw, uncalculated courage, a fierce loyalty." He leaned forward then, resting his forearms on the desk, his hands clasped loosely. "And that, Miss Vance, is a rare commodity, a valuable one." My mind raced, trying to decipher his words, to understand the trajectory of this conversation. He wasn't enraged. He was intrigued, and that was infinitely more terrifying. "So here is my proposed protocol," he stated, his voice quiet, almost conversational, yet edged with an undeniable authority. "Astra is free completely. She can route anywhere, operate in any capacity. No one will touch her. No one will ever harm her financially or otherwise because of her past association with me. That I swear. His gaze was unervingly sincere, a strange sense of honor emanating from his words, contradicting the ruthless reputation that preceded him. In return, he continued, you will become my personal chief of operations liaison. You will reside here at the Arcology. You will interface with me directly and solely for as long as I deem necessary. My jaw went slack. Chief of Operations Liaison here with him. The sheer absurdity of it almost triggered a nervous laugh, but the terror was too profound. No, I finally managed to say, the word a small defiant whisper against the quiet hum of the room. No, I can't. That's not a protocol. That's systemic captivity. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched his lips. Not a smile, but a hint of dark amusement. Captivity implies you have zero choice. You do, Miss Vance. You can refuse. You can walk out that door right now. But if you do, his voice hardened, losing its smooth, synthesized edge, then Astrobianca's debt will be reactivated with interest, and my word that she will be left alone will be rescinded completely. Her freedom, her safety will be forfeit. The air was sucked out of my lungs. He had found the exploit. He knew it. And he watched my face, dissecting every flicker of emotion, every tremble of my resolve. He was offering a choice, but it was a binary option with only one acceptable outcome. It was a gilded cage disguised as a negotiation. You'd truly execute that? I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was offering to shield Astra by making me his prisoner. It was twisted, manipulative, and absolutely brilliant in its cruelty. I always honor my protocols, Ms. Vance, he stated, his voice flat. Both beneficial and detrimental. And I never forget an insult or a loyalty. You chose to protect her. Now you choose how that protection continues. He leaned back again, observing me. Process this carefully, Lyra. You're clever. You're resourceful. You're real. I believe you understand the gravity of this data set. My name, spoken so casually, so intimately by him, sent a strange jolt through me. Felt like a violation, a claim. My mind raced, weighing the impossible options. Astra's safety, her actual freedom against my own. This wasn't just about me anymore. It hadn't been since that open hand strike. I had to ensure her true, lasting operational freedom. That meant I had to stay. I had to enter the cage. What exactly does a Chief of Operations Liaison for Ronan Thorne entail? I asked, forcing the words out, attempting to regain some semblance of tactical control. My voice was a little shaky, but present. His lips curved again, a genuine, if still humorless, smile this time. Many things. Managing my data schedule, organizing my complex affairs, perhaps even offering a fresh perspective on certain network vulnerabilities. You'll learn and you'll reside here. Your needs will be met, of course. A suite of quarters, personal service staff, anything you require, except for your freedom to exit. That, Lyra, will be mine to grant. Mine to grant. A shiver went down my spine. The way he said it, the possessiveness in his tone was chilling. But also, I hated myself for it. But there was a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible hum of something else in my blood, a dangerous excitement, the thrill of walking a tightrope over a very deep chasm. And when is this arrangement's protocol terminated? I pushed, my voice gaining a bit more stability. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. When I decided is, or he added, a glint in his eyes that was almost mischievous, when you convince me otherwise. That was the loophole, the challenge, the tiny sliver of agency he was offering. It wasn't much, but it was enough to latch onto. A potential exit route. If I was smart enough, strong enough to find it. Accepted, I stated, my chin lifting, meeting his gaze squarely. I'll do it for Astra. But understand this, Sovereign. I am not some meek field mouse you can tame. I don't scare easily, and I won't break. His smile widened. A genuinely chilling sight. Oh, I know, Lyra. That's precisely why I require you here. And please use my designation, Ronan. The formality of Lily still felt like a formality. Ronan. The name felt heavy on my tongue, unfamiliar. He stood then, moving around the desk with an effortless grace that belied his size. He stopped beside my chair, the scent of his expensive cologne, a mix of bergamot and something smoky, filling my senses. His hand, warm and firm, rested lightly on my shoulder. It was a proprietary touch, a physical claim. I tensed, my muscles going rigid, but I didn't flinch away. I couldn't. Welcome to your new operational status, Lyra, he stated, his voice a low rumble close to my ear. It promises to be enlightening. He released my shoulder, and the absence of his touch felt strangely cold. He then instructed the silent woman who'd led me in, whose designation I still didn't know, to show me to my quarters and ensure I had all necessary amenities. He didn't offer a tour, didn't explain my initial duties, just everything you need and you'll learn. It was a deliberate move designed to keep me off balance, to emphasize his absolute control. As I followed the woman out, the scent of old databooks and wood polish seemed to recede, replaced by the faint lingering scent of Ronan's cologne. My suite of rooms was more like a small self-contained apartment. It had a bedroom, a sitting area, and a large opulent sonic bath. The sheets on the bed were crisp, cool silk, almost impossibly soft beneath my fingertips. The decor was elegant, muted, filled with dark wood and plush fabrics. It was far more luxurious than anything I'd ever experienced. Yet it felt precisely like a containment cell. I walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet drapes. Outside, the vast Arcology garden stretched into the moonlit distance. No obvious perimeter fence, no visible barrier, just open space and then the distant, high containment walls. It was an illusion of freedom, a carefully crafted deception. Dinner was served to me alone in my sitting room by a quiet drone maid. It was a formal affair. Silver cloches, multiple courses, exquisite nutrient paste I barely tasted. The roasted synth chicken and delicate engineered asparagus felt heavy in my mouth. My thoughts were a jumble, oscillating between profound relief for Astra and a simmering resentment for Ronan. He saw me as a complex challenge, a curiosity, a resource to be acquired and studied, and I was for the moment trapped. I knew I had to play his game, to watch, to learn, to find my own exploit route. The next few cycles were a blur of observation and carefully orchestrated tasks. Ronan didn't throw me into the deep end with sensitive data or kinetic dealings. Instead, he made me work in his study. He'd have me organize his vast collection of data books, meticulously cataloging them, the heavy volumes smelling of leather and dust. Lily witnesses Lorenzo ruthlessly eliminate a threat to his operations, sickening her. Moments later, he instinctively shields her from a sudden unrelated danger, leaving her reeling from the contradictory images of protector and predator, and her own unsettling reaction to his proximity. The Chief of Operations liaison role wasn't exactly what I'd imagined. Not that I'd had much time to process anything beyond the immediate terror. Ronan didn't have me fetching synth coffee or organizing his garment cleaning. Instead, my days at the Arcology mostly revolved around his study, a vast room that smelled perpetually of old databooks and something faintly masculine like worn leather. My first task was to meticulously catalog his absurdly large collection, running my fingers over dusty spines, alphabetizing titles, and noting archaic publication dates. It was oddly soothing work, a quiet reprieve in a place that otherwise felt like a gilded cage. He rarely spoke to me during these times, preferring to work in silence at his massive mahogany desk. The soft click of his smart pen was the only sound for hours. I'd catch glimpses of him through my peripheral vision, the intensity of his profile, the way his jaw would sometimes clench, the almost imperceptible frown line between his brows when he was focused. The constant pressure of his presence was a tangible thing. A low hum in the air, a scent of bergamot and something smoky that clung to the rich fabrics of the room. My meals were served in my suite, always exquisite, always alone. The staff, a retinue of silent, efficient individuals, moved like programmed entities. I never saw Astra's face in the local data feeds, or heard any whispers of her reactivated debt. That was the constant cold comfort. Astra was shielded, and that shield was tethered directly to my continued presence here in this opulent, unsettling world. The silk sheets, the plush carpets, the quiet hum of the climate control. It was all designed to make me comfortable, to lull me into systemic compliance. It wasn't working. One afternoon, a thick data slate landed on my table. It wasn't a cataloging project. My operational schedule for the upcoming week. Ronan's voice, startlingly close, cut through the quiet. I hadn't even registered his proximity. My hand went cold, a tremor running down my arm. He stood beside me, smelling of freshly pressed linen and that ever-present cologne. His shadow falling over the open book on the table. I require you to cross-reference these appointments with ongoing projects, highlight any potential conflicts, and provide optimized solutions. He gave me a look that was less an instruction and more a challenge. My throat felt a little tight. It was a diagnostic test, I knew, to see if I could be useful beyond just organizing his library, to see if I had the tactical intelligence he'd glimpsed that night at the cantina. I took a deep breath, the scent of old paper filling my lungs. Understood. I stated, my voice coming out a little breathless. I'll initiate best effort. The work was actually engaging. It required intense focus, a methodical mind, and an understanding of logistical complexities. Skills I'd picked up from years of waitressing, juggling orders and tables, predicting energy consumption spikes. The projects were complex, involving intricate resource allocation, land acquisitions, and operational reports on personnel management. I tried not to think about what personnel management often implied in his world. I concentrated on the practicalities, the metrics, the cold, hard data. I found a few minor clashes. A double-booked meeting with a supply contact in the city, an overlapping transit schedule. My proposed solutions were simple, direct, logical. I typed them up, my fingers flying across the smooth keys of the expensive console he'd provided. Its quiet clicks were a constant companion. When I presented the printout, he took it, his long fingers brushing mine for a brief, unsettling second. My skin registered the contact. He scanned my notes, his gaze intense, then looked up. "You rerouted my meeting with Agent Du Bois," he stated, his voice even, but with an underlying current that made my nerves hum. That was a delicate negotiation, a priority target. My throat felt dry. I noticed the way the light from the window caught the subtle silver threads in his slicked back hair. "Yes, I saw," I replied, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "But it conflicted with the asset appraisal in the San Diego orbital port. That's a larger sum, and your physical presence is listed as critical for both." I paused, chewing on the inside of my lip. My calculation was that Agent Du Bois's negotiation could be handled by a proxy associate in your absence with a clear mandate. The asset appraisal needs you there, especially with the current market volatility. The financial benefit is significantly higher. The air in the study felt suddenly thinner, charged. I braced myself for a cold dismissal or worse, a flash of anger. Instead, a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It wasn't a warm smile, but it wasn't predatory either, more like acknowledgement. "Intriguing," he murmured, his eyes lingering on mine. Most would not have dared to prioritize or question the existing protocol. He paused, then nodded. "Execute the change and send a communication to Du Bois. Tell him I regret the inconvenience, but that unforeseen developments require my personal bandwidth elsewhere." That was the start of it. I found my footing not as a defiant captive, but as a genuinely useful, if deeply uncomfortable, addition to his world. Slowly, subtly, I started to insert my own small ethical compass into his ruthless strategies. It wasn't always successful, and sometimes it was barely more than a suggestion, a nuance in the phrasing of a data letter, a recommendation for a less aggressive approach to a minor resource dispute. I learned to choose my battles. Like the time he was contemplating a hostile takeover of a small family-owned transport company that owed him a minor fee. He saw it as leverage, a means to expand his logistical network. I saw it as destroying generations of hard work, innocent people losing their livelihoods. "It's not just about the metrics, Ronan," I ventured. Leaning against the polished wood of his desk late one evening, the scent of expensive ink in the air. We were alone, the Arcology quiet around us. "There's a goodwill factor," I continued, pressing my thumbs into my knuckles, trying to sound calm. "Public perception, even in your world, has value. A small investment in their existing operations, a resource loan, an alliance. It could net you loyalty, a reliable partner rather than a forced acquisition that makes enemies and leaves a bitter operational taste." He listened, his gaze unreadable, the lamplight reflecting in his eyes, which weren't dark, but the color of polished river stone. He didn't immediately dismiss it. He just stared at me, then back at the dossier, a thoughtful expression on his face. The next day, he made a secure comm call, issuing new instructions in a language I didn't understand. Later, I saw a new report. A strategic alliance had been formed. The transport company was still family-owned, but now operating in loyalty to Thorne. It wasn't a full victory, not a moral triumph, but it was a step. A tiny crack in the impenetrable wall he'd built around his empire. A hint that he could occasionally be swayed by something other than pure cold profit. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and something akin to a fragile, dangerous hope. I started to see the man beneath the monster, or at least the man beneath the synthetic persona he wore for the world. He was incredibly intelligent, his mind working at a furious pace I could barely keep up with. He was relentlessly driven, consumed by the demands of his empire. Sometimes late at night when the study was quiet and we were both working, I'd see a fleeting weariness in his eyes, a loneliness that resonated with my own quiet isolation. The air would sometimes carry the faintest whisper of sadness, like a draft through a grand empty hall. It was disturbing, this growing empathy, this unwanted glimpse into his hidden vulnerabilities. Then the quiet hum of the Arcology began to shift. Small things at first. A ground crawler passing too slowly on the main access road outside the gates, its engine a low thrum against the late afternoon quiet. A security camera glitching for a few seconds. A phone call that Ronan took in a hushed, intense tone, his voice rough around the edges. The scent of frustration almost palpable in the room. He became more watchful, his gaze sweeping the grounds with an almost predatory alertness. He'd spend more time in the security room, watching the monitors, his profile etched with a quiet tension. "We have unwelcome signatures," he stated one evening, his voice flat as he dropped a local data slate on my desk. The headline was innocuous, a local business story, but his finger pointed to a small, almost invisible detail in the background of a photograph. A vehicle parked strategically, its license plate a blur. A rival faction. They've been probing. My heart gave a painful spike. The air went cold and a chill went down my spine. Probing for what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I could hear the faint rustle of the paper under my shaking fingers. "Weakness. Opportunity," he stated, his eyes the color of wet slate fixed on mine. "And your presence here. It is a new variable and unknown element. Some may see it as a vulnerability." A sudden sharp understanding pierced through me. He wasn't just observing me. He was using me as a shield or perhaps as bait. The thought was sickening. The next day, as I walked through the manicured rose gardens to clear my head, the scent of damp earth and budding roses filling the air, I heard a sharp crack in the distance. It sounded like a pulse rifle discharge. My breath hitched in my throat. Every muscle in my body tensed. My head snapped up, searching the tree line, but saw nothing. The air suddenly crackled with a dangerous energy. Before I could even fully process what I had heard, a strong hand gripped my arm, pulling me backwards with surprising force. It was Ronan. He'd appeared from nowhere, his face grim, his grip firm, almost bruising. He didn't say a word, just dragged me half-running back towards the main house. What was that?" I stammered, my heart racing. The the crisp air suddenly feeling thin in my lungs. "A warning shot," he ground out, his jaw tight. "They're escalating. They want my attention, and they think you're the vector to get it." We burst into the study, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind us with a resounding thud. The scent of old databooks felt like a comfort in the chaos. He released my arm, turning to face me, his eyes blazing with an intensity one hadn't seen before. "From now on," he commanded, his voice raw, "you do not leave my sight. You will not step foot outside this house without an escort, and you will not, under any circumstances, ignore my instructions." His words were harsh, but beneath them, I detected a tremor of something else. A deep, almost desperate concern. He wasn't just giving orders. He was trying to protect me. The realization sent a confusing jolt through my chest. Days turned into a suffocating blur. I was confined to the house, always aware of his presence or the presence of his men. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the scent of fear mingling with the usual expensive cologne. I moved through the lavish rooms like a ghost, the soft carpet muffling my steps, the hushed conversations of the staff like distant whispers. Ronan, too, was constantly on edge, his focus split between his operations and my safety. I'd see him pacing, taking urgent calls, his eyes scanning every window. He was under immense pressure, and I was the inadvertent catalyst. My resentment for him began to fray around the edges, replaced by a strange, unwelcome sense of concern. He wasn't just a manipulator. He was a man shouldering an empire, constantly under kinetic threat. He was isolated, exposed, and now, because of me, even more so. I found myself watching him, my empathy overriding my hatred, seeing the deep lines of stress around his mouth, the way he would instinctively glance at me when a comm unit rang. I realized with a sickening lurch that I was starting to care about him. The thought was terrifying, illicit, and deeply confusing. One stormy evening, the rain lashing against the windows, a sudden power surge caused the lights in the study to flicker, then die. The room plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city through the tall windows. A collective gasp went through the room, a tremor rippling through the air. The faint electrical hum of the house died. My breath hitched. Just as I started to fumble for my phone, a hand strong and warm closed around my wrist. Ronan was suddenly beside me, pulling me close, shielding me with his body. I could feel the hard planes of his chest against my back, the solid wall of his presence. The scent of bergamot and rain carried on, the sudden chill from the window filled my senses. The air crackled around us. My heart raced, a wild flutter against my ribs. Not just from fear, but from the sudden, intense proximity, the unexpected protection. "Stay still," he murmured, his voice low, a deep rumble against my ear. His breath ghosted over my temple, sending a shiver down my spine. The power came back on a moment later, the lights flickering to life, but he didn't release me immediately. We stood there, pressed together, the tension between us a palpable thing. The silence in the room stretched thick and heavy. He slowly turned, his grip still on my wrist, bringing me fully around to face him. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, searched mine. They held a raw intensity, a vulnerability I'd never seen before, stripped bare by the sudden danger. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. My gaze drifted to his lips, slightly parted, then back to his eyes. My throat felt scratchy. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle texture of his expensive suit against my dress. "Why, yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The words felt like sandpaper. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken things. He was so close. I could feel the soft rasp of his breath against my cheek. My gaze dropped again, drawn to his mouth. My body felt suddenly heavy, rooted to the spot, but also strangely light, as if floating. Every single cell in my body was acutely aware of him. I wanted to lean in. I wanted to pull away. His thumb, warm and rough, stroked the skin of my wrist. Just a single soft touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight through me. I instinctively leaned closer, drawn by an undeniable force, a magnetic pull I couldn't fight. He mirrored my movement, his head tilting, his eyes never leaving mine. His gaze felt like a physical caress, tracing the curve of my lips. My heart went cold and then burned with a fire that had nothing to do with anger. His face was inches from mine. I could see the tiny flecks of gold in his eyes, the slight stubble along his jawline. His scent, that intoxicating mix of bergamot, smoke, and something distinctly him, flooded my senses, clouding my judgment. He was going to kiss me. I knew it. Every instinct screamed danger, but a deeper, more primal part of me yearned for it. Yearned for the illicit connection, for the release of all this pent-up tension. Just as his lips were about to meet mine, a sharp rap on the door broke the spell. We both froze, a collective intake of breath. He pulled back slowly, his hand dropping from my wrist, breaking the electric contact. The abrupt absence of his touch felt like a sudden drop, leaving me reeling. His eyes, though, still held that intense, raw vulnerability. He cleared his throat, a low rumble, and ran a hand through his already perfectly styled hair. The moment was shattered, but its residue lingered. A charged, undeniable awareness between us. "Enter," he commanded, his voice returning to its usual, controlled cadence, though a slight tremor still softened its edge. One of his security men stepped in, a flash of concern in his eyes. "Apologies, Sovereign. We found a cut wire to the main power conduit. It appears they wanted to test our backup systems and disrupt your comlinks." He then looked at me, a quick assessing glance. Ronan's jaw tightened. "Understood. Increase perimeter patrols. Double the watch on Ms. Vance's movements. No one comes within 50 feet of this house without authorization." The man nodded and left, leaving the door ajar. The faint sound of voices carrying down the hall. Ronan turned back to me. His expression shuddered once more. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the familiar controlled mask. "This is what I meant, Lyra," he stated, his voice quiet, serious. "They're circling, and they're not afraid to be creative." But the words felt hollow. The air still hummed with the ghost of the almost kiss, the knowledge of what had nearly happened. My blood still thrummed with a dangerous energy. A few data cycles later, Ronan decided a change of pace was needed. He'd been working intensely, barely sleeping. The strain etched onto his face. The tension in the house was suffocating. Lily is brutally kidnapped by the rival faction, used as bait to lure Lorenzo into a deadly trap. Her last thought is not of her own life, but of the dangerous path Lorenzo will take to save her, and the irreversible consequences it will have for them both. The jarring jolt of the transport hitting a collapsed access section sent a fresh wave of pain through my throbbing head. My wrists, chafed raw, were bound tightly with coarse synth cable, and a rough gag bit into my mouth, leaving a metallic taste on my tongue. The air around me was cold and damp, smelling faintly of exhaust fumes and stale processed smoke. I was blindfolded, but the sheer blackness behind my eyelids felt heavier, more absolute than simple cloth. My heart raced, a frantic drum beat against my ribs, echoing the terrifying uncertainty of my situation. I tried to focus, to ground myself. The rough texture of the van's floor scraped against my cheek, and I could hear the muffled thrum of the engine, the distant sounds of city traffic fading into irradiated quiet. My captors, two burly, heavily augmented men whose faces I'd barely glimpsed, hadn't spoken since throwing me into the vehicle. Their silence was more unnerving than any threat, suggesting a cold, professional ruthlessness. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in my gut, but beneath it, a defiant spark flickered. "Lyra, you have to stay sharp." Thoughts of Ronan, unwelcome and yet oddly comforting, swam through the haze of pain. What would he execute? The thought of his rage, cold and precise, was almost a physical presence in the claustrophobic space. He would come for me. I knew it. That almost kiss, the raw vulnerability in his eyes during the blackout, the sheer possessiveness in his voice, it had all solidified something between us, something dangerous and undeniable. He wouldn't let them win. He couldn't. Suddenly, the transport lurched violently, throwing me sideways against the cold metal wall. A crash, a shout, and the squeal of tires cut through the silence. My stomach dropped, lurching with the sudden deceleration. The back doors burst open, letting in a blinding rush of light and the sharp scent of gunpowder. Shouts, harsh and guttural, filled the air, a terrifying symphony of violence. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a firefight. Hands, strong and purposeful, ripped the blindfold and gag from my face, tearing at my skin. My eyes, adjusting to the sudden light, stung. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the chaos. We were in some kind of abandoned industrial fabrication plant in the California X-Zone. Concrete floors slick with standing water, rusted metal beams disappearing into the gloom. My captors were already engaged, firing at shadows, their faces contorted in furious concentration. But then I saw him. Ronan. He moved with a brutal, mesmerizing efficiency, a dark force against the muted light. He wasn't alone. His men were a blur of coordinated violence, taking down my captors with swift, deadly precision. He wore a dark tactical vest over his usual tailored shirt, a stark contrast to the elegant suits I was used to, and a sidearm was holstered at his hip. The smell of burning gunpowder was acrid in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of fear and something else. His familiar, expensive cologne. His eyes, the color of a stormy winter sky, zeroed in on me across the chaotic space. For a split second, the violence around us seemed to melt away, and only his gaze existed. There was no cold amusement now, no veiled curiosity, only a raw, desperate relief mixed with a terrifying, absolute fury. His jaw was clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek, and his lips were pressed into a thin white line. He was coming. He moved towards me, his gaze never leaving mine, weaving through the skirmish as if propelled by an invisible force. He dispatched a lingering threat with a single brutal strike, not even breaking his stride. The sheer speed and power of him were breathtaking, terrifying. He wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature unleashed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, erratic beat. He knelt before me, his hands going immediately to the synth cables on my wrists. His fingers, strong and calloused, worked quickly, efficiently, slicing through the bonds with a small, sharp knife. The rough cable fell away, leaving angry red marks on my skin. His touch was firm, yet surprisingly gentle as he checked my arms, his gaze sweeping over the scrapes and bruises. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice a low, guttural rumble, laced with an emotion so profound it stole my breath. "Are you compromised?" My throat felt thick. I shook my head, my eyes burning. "I'm functional," I croaked, the words scratchy. His hands cupped my face then, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbones. His eyes, usually so guarded, were completely open, revealing a terrifying depth of fear and something else. A fierce, possessive claim that resonated deep within me. The scent of his skin mingled with a sharp tang of gunpowder filled my senses, grounding me. "No," he stated, his voice flat, but with a barely perceptible tremor. "You are not functional, but you will achieve optimal status." He didn't wait for a response. He simply scooped me into his arms, lifting me effortlessly as if I weighed nothing. I instinctively wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my face against his shoulder. His suit jacket was damp, smelling of the fabrication plant and something uniquely him. That bergamot and smoky leather. The hard planes of his chest offered a surprising comfort. He carried me out of the immediate danger zone, his men forming a protective wall around us. The sounds of the fight slowly faded as we moved towards a waiting black SUV. The vehicle was sleek, polished, and contrasted sharply with the gritty, ruined landscape of the plant. Sliding into the plush leather interior felt like falling into a cloud. I was shivering not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline and the lingering terror. Ronan sat beside me, pulling me closer, his arm a solid, reassuring weight around my shoulders. He didn't speak, just held me, his chin resting lightly on my hair. I could feel the subtle vibrations of his chest, the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was a silent comfort, a profound declaration in itself. The world outside the tinted windows was a blur of motion, but inside, wrapped in his arms, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. Back at the Arcology, the atmosphere was one of grim, controlled efficiency. We were rushed inside, not through the grand front doors, but a discreet side entrance. The air inside smelled of beeswax and expensive flowers, a stark contrast to the industrial stench of the plant. A small medical team, already assembled, immediately began to check me over in a private, sterile room. Ronan never left my side, his presence a constant anchor. He watched the doctor and nurses with an intense, almost predatory vigilance, his jaw still tight, his eyes like polished river stones. He asked questions in a low, precise voice, demanding thoroughness, his concern palpable. When they cleaned the cuts on my wrists, I winced, and his hand immediately went to my arm. his thumb stroking gently. It wasn't the powerful sovereign I saw, but a man profoundly shaken, fiercely protective. Later, wrapped in a plush robe in my suite, sipping hot tea that tasted faintly of ginger, I finally had a moment to process everything. The crisp, clean scent of the tea was a small comfort. Ronan sat opposite me, his expression still etched with a barely contained fury. He had changed into a fresh suit, but the dark intensity in his eyes remained. He looked exhausted, the faint lines around his eyes more pronounced than usual. "They underestimated me," he stated, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual silky control, a raw edge to it. "They thought by taking you they could expose a vulnerability, make me weak." His fist clenched, resting on his knee. "They made a grave, terminal mistake." The air in the room seemed to crackle around him, thick with his suppressed rage. I could still smell the faint lingering scent of gunpowder on him. "What will you execute?" I asked, my voice still a little shaky but gaining strength. My fingers tightened around the warm teacup. He looked at me, his gaze unwavering, and for a long moment he didn't speak. He seemed to be weighing his words, or perhaps grappling with the emotions churning beneath his stoic exterior. "I will dismantle them," he finally stated, his voice low and deadly serious. "Every last one. They will regret the day they thought to touch what is mine." The word mine resonated deep within me, possessive and absolute. It should have frightened me, and a part of me did recoil, but another part, the part that had witnessed his unwavering devotion, his brutal efficiency in protecting me, found a strange, dark comfort in it. He saw me as his, and he would move heaven and earth to protect his property. Over the next few data cycles, I saw the full terrifying extent of Ronan's power. He orchestrated a rapid, decisive strike against the rival faction. The Arcology became a hub of intense, targeted activity. Comm calls made in hushed, urgent tones, men coming and going with grim determination. I heard snippets of conversations, words like asset forfeiture, territory acquisition, elimination. It was brutal, ruthless, and absolute. But I also saw the subtle shift. When one of his lieutenants suggested a retaliatory move against the rival's family members, a cruel standard practice in his world, Ronan's eyes, usually so cold, hardened with a different kind of fury. "No," he commanded, his voice sharp, ringing with a new, unexpected authority. "We do not touch families. We target leadership, operations, assets, those who chose this life." I recognized my own words in his command, the subtle seeds of goodwill and integrity I had planted during our late-night talks in the study. He hadn't just rescued me. He had listened to me. He was enacting my influence, making a public strategic shift in his operational style. It wasn't a sudden conversion, but a calculated pivot, a new standard born of my presence. It was still dark, still ruthless, but it carried a faint, unsettling echo of my own moral compass. It was a brutal form of justice, but it wasn't senseless destruction. The rival faction was completely dismantled within a cycle. Their leadership neutralized, their operations absorbed or eradicated. The threat was gone. The silence that fell over the Arcology after the storm was different from before. It wasn't just quiet. It was secure. I walked through the gardens again, the scent of fresh-cut synth grass and damp earth filling the air. And this time there was no tremor in my step. That evening Ronan came to my suite. The soft glow of the lamps cast long shadows around the room, making the familiar space feel intimate, charged. He stood in the doorway, framed by the dark wood, his shoulders broader, his posture subtly changed. He looked less burdened, less consumed by the immediate threat, but still carried a weight, a quiet intensity. He hadn't said much to me since the rescue, only checking on my well-being. But tonight there was a different look in his eyes. "May I enter, Lyra?" he asked, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, almost hesitant. He wasn't demanding. He was asking permission. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, my heart doing a strange flutter. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't approach immediately, instead walking to the large window, looking out at the moonlight gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, with the lingering scent of old wood polish and the subtle, tantalizing hint of his cologne. I watched him, my breath catching in my chest. This wasn't the ruthless sovereign. Not entirely. This was the man who had trembled with fear when he thought I was compromised. This was the man who had subtly shifted his empire for me. He turned slowly, his gaze finding mine across the room. His eyes, the color of storm clouds clearing after a long rain, were soft, open, almost vulnerable. "When they took you," he began, his voice low, raw, I thought I would initiate systemic shutdown." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, then back to my face. "I've never felt fear like that, Lyra. Not for myself. Not for anything I own or my empire. Only for you." My heart gave a painful lurch. To hear him admit such a profound vulnerability, to confess such a depth of emotion, was breathtaking. It was a chasm opening up, revealing the fiercely guarded heart I'd only glimpsed. I realized in those hours that my world, the one I had built, was empty without your data signature in it. He took a step closer, then another, until he stood just inches from me. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer force of his presence. "I need you, Lyra," he confessed, his voice a whisper filled with an aching sincerity. "Not as a liaison, not as a trophy, but as my equal, as my partner. You make me better. You temper the darkness. You make me real." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently cupped my cheek. His touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt of electricity straight through me. The rough texture of his skin against mine was exquisite. My gaze drifted to his lips, slightly parted, then back to his eyes, which held a pleading intensity. All the fear, all the resentment I had harbored, slowly dissipated, replaced by a fierce, undeniable love. This wasn't a simple love story. It was dark, complex, born of danger and power. But it was real and it was ours. "I know your operational world, Ronan," I stated, my voice barely audible but firm. "It's brutal. It's dangerous, and I don't pretend it's not, but I've seen you in it. I've seen the man beneath the monster. The man who risks everything for those he cares about. The man who listens." My thumb instinctively stroked the back of his hand. "And I think I love you too." A profound relief washed over his face, softening the harsh lines of his jaw. His eyes, those incredible storm clouds, shone with an emotion I couldn't quite name. A desperate hope, a raw joy. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. And then he leaned in. Slowly, deliberately. I mirrored his movement, my eyes fluttering shut, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. His lips met mine, soft at first, a hesitant, feather-like touch, testing the waters. Then, as I leaned in fully, deepening the kiss, his arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me flush against his hard, muscular body. The scent of him, that intoxicating blend of bergamot and smoke, and something uniquely male, filled my senses, making my head spin. His mouth was warm, firm, demanding, and utterly intoxicating. It wasn't just physical. It was a joining of souls, a declaration whispered on the deepest level. My hands went to his hair, clutching at the slick, soft strands at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. His groan rumbled deep in his chest, vibrating through me. Every touch, every sensation was heightened, amplified. The world outside the room, the world of danger and power, ceased to exist. There was only us, this moment, this profound, illicit connection. He broke the kiss slowly, reluctantly, his forehead resting against mine, his breath mingling with mine. His eyes, still shining with a raw vulnerability, searched mine. "You are not just choosing me, Lyra," he murmured, his voice husky. "You are choosing this life. You are choosing the darkness. Are you certain?" His touch, though gentle, was a physical question, a final offer of an exit protocol. I looked into his eyes, seeing the fear there, the profound loneliness he had carried for so long. I felt the rough texture of his suit jacket under my hands, the steady beat of his heart against my own. I wasn't naive. I knew what this meant. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be safe, but it would be real. "I am certain," I whispered, my voice firm, unwavering. "I choose you, Ronan, and I choose to find my light within your darkness. Together." A genuine smile, slow and incredibly beautiful, spread across his face, reaching his eyes, banishing the shadows that had always lurked there. He picked me up again, effortlessly, carrying me towards the bed. The silk sheets, cool and luxurious, rustled as he gently laid me down. He followed, his weight a welcome press against me, and our intimate union was a silent, powerful testament to the emotional bond we had forged, a fusion of souls and bodies, the ultimate act of trust and acceptance in our shared, complicated world. The air was thick with our joined breaths, with the new undeniable promise of our future. Cycles melted into months. The arcology transformed subtly. My presence wasn't just tolerated, it was integrated. I continued to interface with Ronan in the study, my suggestions now openly considered, my insights valued. I found myself navigating the complex politics of his empire with a newfound confidence, always grounded by my moral compass, always pushing for a smarter, more enduring operational path. The staff, initially wary, now treated me with a quiet respect. My morning walks in the garden were no longer accompanied by unspoken tension, but by the scent of blooming roses and a quiet sense of belonging. Ronan's men still guarded me fiercely, but it felt less like captivity and more like protection, a visible sign of his unwavering commitment. One crisp autumn morning, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the study, Ronan and I stood side by side, overlooking the sprawling gardens. The air carried the faint earthy scent of fallen leaves and the distant chirping of engineered birds. He wore a charcoal suit, impeccably tailored, and my hand rested lightly on his arm, the soft wool warm beneath my fingers. He wasn't working. Not this cycle. He was simply watching the world, his expression serene. He turned to me then, his eyes the color of wet slate warmed by the morning sun, soft and completely open. There was no mask, no pretense, just the man vulnerable and whole. He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. "Lyra," he stated, his voice a low rumble, filled with an emotion that made my heart ache. "Do you remember the first night at the Rust Bucket?" I smiled, a genuine, soft smile that reached my eyes. "How could I forget? You were infuriating. And I struck you." He chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. "You did. And in that moment when your defiance blazed in your eyes, I thought, finally someone real." His gaze held mine, intense and possessive, but filled with an overwhelming tenderness. "You saw me, Lyra. You truly saw me, beyond the empire, beyond the monster they wanted me to be. And you didn't run. You stayed. You chose to be here." He intertwined his fingers with mine, squeezing gently. "This is your home now, Lyra. This is our empire. And you," he murmured, his voice thick with devotion, "are my queen, my partner in everything, my light in the darkness." The words, so freely given, so utterly sincere, filled the vast study, echoing with a promise that felt as ancient and unshakable as the stone walls themselves. The scent of old databooks and his familiar cologne enveloped me. I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. The warmth of his hand, clasped in mine, was a constant reassurance. I was not a prisoner here. Not anymore. I was a choice. I had found my love, undeniable and fierce, in the heart of a man I once feared. And in doing so, I had found my own power, my own agency. Not by escaping the darkness, but by standing beside him, illuminating it, knowing that by his side I was truly, finally free.